4:51 a.m., Crittenden County, Arkansas. The sky above the delta was still black. No moon. Temperature sitting at 53 degrees Fahrenheit. A wet May chill off the Mississippi bottomland. Kurt Eberly had been driving Lint routes for 22 years, and he knew exactly what a cotton gin looked like in the off-season. It looked like nothing. Dark, still, shut down. Tilbury Brothers Gin had not run a single bale since mid-March. The rollers were pulled. The fiber lines were offline. The co-op had signed its last weight ticket for the season 8 weeks earlier. Nothing should have been moving inside that compound after dark. Something was moving. Eberly had pulled into the adjacent farm lane to check a flat on his trailer, the Hendricks property, next lot over, where he had a Tuesday morning pickup scheduled. He was crouched beside the left rear axle with a flashlight when he looked up and saw two things that did not belong to a dead gin in May. The dust collection cyclone on the south wall of the Tilbury Annex was spinning, not fast, but moving, and on the high rectangular window cut into the annex's east face, there was a yellow interior light. It was 4:51 in the morning. The gin was supposed to be locked. Eberly stood up. He looked at the cyclone for a full minute. He looked at the window. He got back in his truck. He did not call the sheriff immediately. He sat with it. He had known the Tilbury family since his father drove these same routes, and he did not want to make trouble over a maintenance crew working early. He drove to the Hendricks elevator, loaded his trailer, and drove home. He made coffee. He thought about the window. The yellow light had not flickered. It was not a work lamp. Work lamps flash and swing. This had been steady, contained, like overhead fluorescence in a room with people in it. At 6:15 that same morning, Eberly called the Crittenden County Sheriff's Office. That call, made from a kitchen in West Memphis, Arkansas on May 13, 2026, would take 16 women home. The women had been inside the annex for 83 days. They had arrived in groups of 3 and 4, beginning in late February 2026. Each of them had answered the same posting. The advertisement appeared in English and Spanish on a rotation of labor placement boards, regional job forums, and one paid social media campaign targeting women between the ages of 20 and 40 in rural communities across Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, and eastern Arkansas. The posting described a seasonal farm supervisor program run by a company called Delta Field Placements LLC. The job listed a start date, a compensation rate, and a contact number. It promised orientation, housing, and a path to a permanent supervisory contract with participating co-op farms across the Mid-South. It looked legitimate. Delta Field Placements had a registered address in a strip mall office suite in South Haven, Mississippi, a suburb just across the state line from Memphis. The company had filed articles of incorporation in October 25. It had a website, a phone number answered by a human voice, and a letterhead. It had a federal employer identification number obtained 3 weeks after incorporation. What it did not have was a single actual farming contract, not one. The recruiter who had built the shell was a man later identified in federal court documents under the alias Marcus Vell, age 44. He had operated labor placement fronts in 3 prior iterations, under different entity names, across Georgia, Louisiana, and North Carolina, none of which had resulted in prosecution. He had learned from each shutdown. He had refined the architecture. Delta Field Placements was his most polished construction yet. The recruitment process had 3 stages. Stage 1, a phone screening. A woman answered, described the program professionally, asked for work history and references. Applicants who passed were told they would be contacted for an in-person orientation at a regional site. Stage 2, transport. Vell's network sent a driver, always a different driver, always a private vehicle, to collect accepted applicants from their home counties. The women were told they were being taken to an orientation facility. Several were collected from bus stops or parking lots they had been directed to by text message. The routes crossed state lines. None of the women were told in advance they would leave their home state. By the time they realized the drive had gone too long, they were already in a moving vehicle on a rural highway. Stage 3, the annex. The Tilbury Annex sat behind the main gin building and the seed house, connected by a covered loading corridor. It had been retrofitted during the prior fall. A locked corridor divided the annex from the loading passage. Inside, a dormitory built into the old bale storage racks, bunks in 3 tiers. 2 industrial shower stalls converted from a utility washdown station. A generator tapped off the gin's bulk feed electrical supply, which meant the meter at the road never registered an anomaly. The windows had been covered from the inside with construction sheeting, all except the high east-facing window, which was above the bale racks and not visible from the annex floor. Whoever retrofitted the space had not thought about that window. The 16 women held inside ranged in age from 21 to 38. They had been reported missing at various points between late January and mid-April 2026. Reports had gone to sheriff's offices and police departments across 4 states: Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas. None had been cross-indexed. The National Crime Information Center had entries for 11 of the 16. But Nunkik, returns on adult females require active follow-through by requesting agencies, and several of the originating reports had been filed as voluntary disappearances pending investigation, a classification that slows urgency. The women had been told the door to the corridor was on a timer. They were told it would open at the end of the orientation period. They were told the program required a confidential onboarding phase for legal reasons related to agricultural licensing. The door was not on a timer. The door was a steel core unit with a commercial deadbolt keyed from the outside. There was no interior handle on the corridor side. What's visible in the federal indictments is how normal the whole thing looked from outside. An idle gin, a registered company, a real address. The crime wasn't hidden in elaborate schemes. It hid in bureaucratic gaps, seasonal dormancy, normal vacancy, places nobody inspects because there's no reason to. Crittenden County Sheriff's Deputy Raymond Okafor took Kurt Eberle's call at 6:17 a.m. on May 13th. He logged it as a welfare check and drove out to Tilbury Brothers at 7:05. He parked at the front gate. The main gin building was dark and locked. The front office was dark. He walked the perimeter. The cyclone on the south wall was not moving. Whatever had been running it had stopped, or had been stopped, in the hours since Eberle's call. Okafor looked up at the annex. He saw the covered window. He saw a steel door on the loading corridor that had a commercial lock set. He noted that the door showed recent installation, no weather oxidation on the hardware, shim marks still visible in the frame. He took photographs with his phone. He went back to his vehicle and wrote the observation in his incident log. Then he called his supervisor. The supervisor called the FBI field office in Little Rock at 9:45 a.m. The Little Rock duty agent who took the call was Special Agent Patricia Norwell. She had worked violent crimes and human exploitation for 11 years, the last 4 out of the Little Rock field office. She listened to the description: an idle gin, an operating cyclone, a retrofitted door, a dawn light in a sealed annex, and she asked one question: has anyone gone inside? No. Good. Don't. Norwell called DEA Group 12 in Memphis at 10:20. Group 12 held a joint intelligence function covering the Mid-South corridor, including cross-state labor exploitation patterns. The group supervisor, an agent identified in court documents as Special Agent in Charge Douglas Fenn, had seen Delta Field Placement's name surface once before, in a financial surveillance pull from a Western Union compliance flag generated in March 26. A recruiter had been moving cash payments through Western Union branches across 4 cities using different sender names, but routing to the same mobile phone number. The compliance flag had been noted and queued. It had not yet risen to active investigation. Fenn pulled the flag. He cross-referenced it against none missing person entries for adult women in the 4-state region. He found 11 correlating entries. He called Norwell back. By 2 p.m. on May 13th, the FBI and DEA had opened a joint case. The investigation that followed lasted 6 days. Not because agents were slow, because they were careful, and that mattered. If the operation went in too early, without full intelligence on the annex layout, the corridor lock, and the number of individuals inside, the risk of a compromised breach was significant. Steel core doors absorb shaped charges differently than standard commercial entries. An imprecise breach on a retrofitted structure in the dark could cause structural collapse in a confined space. They needed the floor plan. They needed to know what was inside. The GIN's original building permits and structural drawings were on file with the Arkansas Department of Labor and Licensing. Norwell's team pulled them through an administrative subpoena served May 14th. The drawings were from 1981 and showed the original annex configuration: a single open bale storage room, no corridor subdivision. The retrofit was entirely post-permit. It had not been filed or inspected. This was the first obstacle the investigation team hit directly. Without a current floor plan of the annex interior, HRT, the FBI's hostage rescue team, which had been alerted and was staging in Memphis by May 15th, could not run a reliable entry simulation. A breach plan, built on a 45-year-old structural drawing with an unknown interior retrofit, was a plan built on a gap. The team solved it through a combination of two approaches. First, ground-penetrating radar. A technical unit drove a utility vehicle along the exterior of the annex on May 15th, using GPR equipment concealed under a Southern Co-op livery, a cover vehicle that would not draw attention near a GIN facility. The GPR scan, combined with thermal imaging from a low-altitude drone run at 3 a.m. on May 16th, produced a workable three-dimensional approximation of the interior. The corridor ran the full north to south length of the annex. The dormitory occupied the eastern two-thirds. The thermal imaging showed, and this is the detail that Norwell later described in court testimony, 16 distinct heat signatures, clustered in a space roughly 40 feet by 30 feet. All human, all alive. 16. That number confirmed the well kick cross-reference. It also told the team that Vell's network had not stopped recruiting after the annex was occupied. The last woman to be brought in had been reported missing from a county in northern Alabama on April 9, 2026, 5 weeks after the first group arrived. The second obstacle came on May 17th, 3 days before the planned breach. An agent running a parallel track on Delta Field Placements Incorporation documents discovered that the registered agent listed on the filing was a paralegal at a South Haven law office, someone who had filed the articles as a routine service for a client she had never met in person, communicating only through an encrypted messaging application. The paralegal was not a co-conspirator, but her involvement meant Vell's trail through the corporate paperwork would dead end there unless they found another thread. The thread was Western Union. I spent time going through the financial compliance records on this case, and one transaction pattern kept nagging at me. A recruiter in 4 states who was careful enough to use different sender names, but not careful enough to protect his mobile number. The compliance flags showed 14 separate transfers over 11 weeks. All small enough to stay below standard reporting thresholds, but the receiving number appeared on all 14. That mobile number was registered to a prepaid carrier under a false name, but prepaid carriers log cell tower pings on activation and on each subsequent use. On May 17th, a federal magistrate in Memphis signed a tower data warrant. The phone had activated at a tower in Olive Branch, Mississippi. It had been used repeatedly within a 2-mile radius, centered on a residential address in the Olive Branch city limits. DEA Group 12 ran physical surveillance on the address beginning May 18th. On May 19th, at 11:14 a.m., a man matching Vell's description left the residence and drove to a Western Union branch in South Haven. He made a cash transfer. The agent running surveillance photographed his face. Facial recognition returned a match inside 90 minutes. to a prior labor exploitation investigation out of Atlanta, Georgia, from 2022, a case that had been closed without charges, when key witnesses could not be located. The mastermind behind 16 women being held in an Arkansas cotton gin had walked away clean once before. He was not going to walk away again. Here is something that will probably draw disagreement. The 2022 Atlanta investigation should never have been closed without charges. The pattern was documented. The shell company structure was identified. The witnesses disappeared because the protection framework for adult exploitation victims in labor recruitment cases was, and remains, inadequate. The system did not fail those women in 2022 because it couldn't solve the case. It failed them because it chose not to sustain the effort required to protect the people who could have testified. That failure directly enabled everything that happened in Arkansas. Vell was placed under 24-hour physical surveillance beginning May 19th. He was not approached. He was not alerted. The breach was set for first light on May 21st, 2026. HRT staged at a National Guard facility outside of Marion, Arkansas, 12 miles from the gin. DEA Group 12 ran a parallel evidence team targeting the gin office and the South Haven address simultaneously. The Little Rock field office coordinated with 4 additional field offices: Nashville, Birmingham, Atlanta, and Jackson, Mississippi, each holding arrest teams on standby for individuals identified in the recruitment network across those cities. 5 individuals total, beyond Vell: a driver in Memphis, a logistics coordinator in Birmingham, a woman who had managed the social media placement campaign from Jackson, a second driver in Nashville, and a man in Atlanta who had served as the financial intermediary, the person who had received cash from Vell and distributed operational payments to the others. 5 separate cities, simultaneous takedowns, all timed to go the moment HRT made the initial entry at the gin. The night before the operation, the team received information that changed the timeline in a way nobody had anticipated. Thermal imaging from a third drone run on the night of May 20th showed that one of the 16 heat signatures in the annex had moved out of the dormitory cluster and was sitting against the interior wall of the locked corridor, the wall directly adjacent to the steel door. The signature was stationary. It had been there for over 2 hours. One of the women was at the door. The team had no way to know why, whether she had heard something outside, whether she had tried the door again, as she may have tried it dozens of times before, whether she had simply moved there out of the compressed routine of confinement. What it meant tactically was that the breach sequence had to account for a person directly behind the entry point. HRT entry coordinators modified the breach protocol on 2 hours' notice. Instead of a standard explosive entry on the corridor door, they would use a hydraulic breach tool on the deadbolt, with a simultaneous acoustic diversion at the far end of the annex, a noisemaker deployed through a small hole cut in the east wall above the bale racks, designed to draw attention toward the back of the space in the 2 seconds between breach and entry. The modification added 11 minutes to the staging sequence. It was approved. It's 4:49 a.m. on May 21st. Norwell has 16 women inside a steel door annex. She has a modified entry protocol tested once in simulation. She has 5 parallel arrest teams across 4 cities waiting for her signal. She has a suspect under surveillance 12 miles away, and 1 woman is sitting against the door. The HRT element moved into position at 5:03 a.m. The gin compound was approached from 3 directions. A vehicle on the road frontage with emergency lighting blocked the access lane. 2 agents covered the generator feed at the rear of the main building, prepared to isolate power to the annex on command, a measure designed to prevent anyone inside the gin office from triggering an alert. A 6-agent breach element moved down the loading corridor from the rear entrance of the main building, using the covered passage as their approach. At 5:14 a.m., the acoustic diversion deployed. 2 seconds later, the hydraulic tool hit the deadbolt. The door opened on the first application. The woman sitting against the corridor wall was 31 years old. She had been reported missing from a town in western Tennessee on February 28, 2026, 11 weeks and 3 days before the breach. When the door opened, she did not immediately move. She remained seated. She looked at the agents in the corridor, tactical gear, floodlights, a female agent from the Little Rock office who had been positioned at the front of the element for exactly this reason, and she did not speak for several seconds. The female agent crouched down and said, "We're federal agents. You're going home." The woman put her face in her hands. All 16 women were accounted for within 4 minutes of breach, medically cleared on scene by an EMS team that had been staged 300 yards down the road, not at the gate, where vehicles would have been visible during the approach. All 16 were transported by ambulance convoy to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis, where restrained clinical examinations confirmed conditions consistent with prolonged confinement. Physicians documented findings across all 16 patients. The reports were filed that same day with the court. At 5:17 a.m., 3 minutes after the annex door opened, the simultaneous arrest teams across 4 cities received the go signal. Vell was taken at his Olive Branch residence at 5:22 a.m. He was in the kitchen. He did not resist. He was transported to the Federal Detention Center in Oxford, Mississippi. The driver in Memphis was taken at a gas station on Summer Avenue at 5:23 a.m. The logistics coordinator in Birmingham was arrested at his apartment complex at 5:24. The social media coordinator in Jackson was detained at 5:21. She had been watching for the signal and moved to her vehicle. She was intercepted in the parking lot of her complex before she reached the street. The financial intermediary in Atlanta was arrested at 5:26. 5 arrests, 6 cities, 13 minutes from first breach to final custody. The most striking element of the entire takedown, and it only becomes apparent when you read the operational timeline carefully, is that the South Haven Law Office's registered agent, the paralegal who had unknowingly filed the incorporation documents for Delta Field placements, was the first person to call the FBI voluntarily after the news broke. She called the Little Rock field office at 7:45 that morning. She had seen a news alert on her phone. She said she had a client file she wanted to hand over immediately, and that she was sorry she had not known sooner. She was never charged. What happened next required a second wave of legal action across 3 federal jurisdictions. The federal indictments returned by a grand jury in the Eastern District of Arkansas named Marcus Vell on 11 counts, including conspiracy to commit forced labor, interstate transportation, in furtherance of coercion, and obstruction. The obstruction count related to evidence that Vell had been tipped about the 2022 Atlanta investigation before it closed and had destroyed documentation at that time. The tip's source has not been publicly identified. It remains an open line in the case. The 5 co-defendants were named on varying subsets of charges consistent with their roles. The driver in Nashville, identified in the indictment as Darnell Crisp, entered a cooperation agreement within 48 hours of his arrest. His testimony identified 2 additional individuals, a property facilitator who had arranged the annex retrofit at Tilbury Brothers, and a second recruiter, operating independently under a separate shell entity in Louisiana, whose activities Crisp described as running parallel to Vell's operation, but not directly connected. The property facilitator, a man from Blytheville, Arkansas, named in the indictment under the alias Red Soames, was arrested at his home on May 23, 2026. He was charged with conspiracy and destruction of property for alterations made to the gin annex without owner consent or permits. The Tilbury family, 3rd-generation operators of the gin, with no knowledge of or involvement in the annex retrofit, cooperated fully with the investigation. Federal court records indicate that Soames had approached a former employee of the gin, since terminated, who had provided access to the property during the November and December 2025 retrofit period, when the gin was between harvest seasons and largely unmonitored. The former employee has not been located. As of the date of the federal filing, he is considered a fugitive. The Tilbury Brothers gin facility was placed under federal asset forfeiture as an instrumentality of the charged offenses. The forfeiture action named the property itself, the annex structure, and associated real property. Whether the Tilbury family will successfully contest the forfeiture is a separate civil proceeding that had not yet been fully resolved at the time of this account. The Louisiana recruiter, described by Crisp, was the subject of an FBI field investigation opened in the Southern District of Louisiana in late May 2026. That investigation is active. What Crisp's cooperation revealed, and what the court filings make plain, is that Delta Field Placements was not a standalone operation. It was one node in a loosely affiliated network of labor recruitment fronts that shared methodologies, document templates, and in some cases, logistics infrastructure. The network had no formal hierarchy. Vell had not built it. He had joined it and refined his piece of it. How many other nodes existed, and where, was not fully known at the time the indictments were filed. That is not a loose end in the documentation. It is a stated uncertainty. Federal prosecutors acknowledged in a press statement on May 27, 2026, that the investigation into affiliated networks was ongoing and that additional charges in other districts were possible. There is a line in the indictment that reads almost like a procedural footnote, but it stayed with me when I went through the filing. The count describing the Western Union transfers notes that 14 of them fell below the standard reporting threshold, each one designed to avoid triggering automated compliance alerts. The network had studied the thresholds. 14 transactions, 11 weeks, the entire operation funded and sustained through a series of amounts chosen specifically to disappear inside the reporting gap. The gap existed, the network knew about it, and it used it 83 days before a lint hauler's flashlight found a spinning cyclone in the wrong season. Did the system fail these women when it closed the Atlanta case in 2022, or was that failure inevitable, given an enforcement structure that doesn't prioritize labor exploitation until it becomes impossible to ignore? Kurt Eberly gave a brief statement to local media on May 21st. He said he had not been certain he was seeing anything worth calling about. He said the flat tire was what put him in that lane. He said he was glad it happened when it did. He did not describe himself as a hero. The reporters who wrote the story did not describe him that way either. He drove a lint route for 22 years, and he knew what a gin looked like in May. That was what he contributed to the case. That was enough. Of the 16 women recovered from the annex, 15 were able to provide identifying information and were reunited with family members within 72 hours of rescue. The 16th, a woman whose identifying documents had been confiscated at intake and whose name the other women knew only by a shortened first name, required additional time to establish identity. She was identified through fingerprint comparison against a prior misdemeanor record 4 days after the breach. Her family was contacted on May 25th. All 16 received medical follow-up care. 14 accepted referral to federally supported victim services. The other 2 declined contact with support services, which is their right. Their locations are not public. The money Vell collected through the financial intermediary in Atlanta has been partially traced. Approximately $94,000 of the total amount moved through the network has been identified and is subject to forfeiture proceedings. An estimated $41,000 in cash, believed to have been held in physical form at a secondary location used by Vell prior to his arrest, has not been recovered. Federal investigators believe the cash was moved or destroyed in the hours between Vell's last confirmed movement on May 20th and his arrest on the morning of May 21st. There is a window of approximately 18 hours, the night of May 20th, into the early morning of May 21st, during which Vell's activities are not fully accounted for. Surveillance was on the Olive Branch residence, but not continuous. The gap exists in the record. Delta Field Placement's website was taken offline by court order on May 21st. The hosting provider confirmed that the site had received over 3,000 unique visitors in the weeks it was active. The number of individuals who submitted applications to the program and were not subsequently collected, or were turned away for operational reasons, is not known. Several women who had received callbacks from the program but had not yet been scheduled for transport came forward to law enforcement after the news broke. Their accounts were taken and incorporated into the evidentiary record. The program had been actively recruiting when the annex door was opened. There were names on a list. Some of those names belonged to women who do not yet know they were on it. The Tilbury Brothers Gin will not operate this coming harvest season. The federal forfeiture hold covers the entirety of the facility, pending the outcome of the civil proceeding. The family has filed a claimant's petition, asserting that they were victims of the property facilitator's unauthorized access and are entitled to return of the property. The petition was pending as of late June 2026. Kurt Eberly still drives the Delta Lint routes. He said, in a follow-up interview, that he hasn't changed much about his morning routine. He leaves early. He notices things. The recruitment shell that held 16 American women in an Arkansas farm annex for 83 days is dismantled. The enforcement gap that made it possible to run a similar operation for years in Atlanta without a single conviction remains exactly where it was. The next posting is already out there, on some rotation of labor boards, describing a seasonal program, a compensation rate, and an orientation that requires a long drive to a location the applicant has never heard of. The system did not fail these women once. It failed them in 2022, and then handed the same man more time to build a better cage. The demand that creates that market still exists. The methodology that funds it is still below most reporting thresholds. And somewhere in Louisiana, a federal investigation is running quietly against a network that no one has publicly named yet. Will we see a federal labor exploitation case in the next 5 years that traces back to the same network documentation uncovered in this one? The annex door is open now. The gin is dark. The cyclone is still. And there are $41,000 in cash that nobody has